So, gosh, how nice it is to have you all here. And what a totally beautiful day. I don't know about you, but the more sunshine in the room, the better I feel. So I'm Karen Wolf. I'm the director and librarian of the John Carter Brown Library, and it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you not only to the library, but also for us to host the launch of the Race and Regency Lab. As a library of the early Americas, with collections that hold materials created in or about the Americas from the 15th to the 19th centuries, the JCB is fundamentally a library of colonialism. Our collections document science and democracy, and indigenous dispossession, and the acts and legacies of Atlantic slavery. One of our core commitments is to think about and facilitate advanced work on all of these topics and more, but also on how the library's own work has shaped our understanding of them, sometimes in capacious ways we want to embrace and stand behind, but other times, frankly, in ways that reflect a narrower, more pinched perspective. And it's in this spirit that we're delighted to host the launch of the Race and Regency Lab. As you'll hear soon from its director, Dr. Patricia Matthew, the lab has an exciting agenda for public-facing humanities work. It's been such an honor and such a joy to work with Tricia on the advisory board for the lab and to work in this collective of incredible scholars, some of whom you're going to be hearing from today. I also want to thank all the folks at the JCB who have worked so hard to make this happen, first among them, Gianna. There we go. And as everything at this library, it is always a full team effort, and this is an incredible team. There we go. Thank you. And then I also want to thank our friends in facilities and in media services who make this not just an event, but an event that everybody can hear and see and is fully accessible to all of the folks who have joined us online. So thank you. Thank you. It takes a lot to put on something like this, and we're really, really appreciative. I also want to point out before Tricia comes up and gives us the formal kind of launch of the lab discussion that we hope to have plenty of time for discussion, but we'll see. We're going to try to hold comments in each session so that we have plenty of time for at least some Q&A. We will be monitoring the Q&A on the Zoom, and also Joe Rezick, wherever Joe is, right over there, will also have a microphone and will zoom around the room for folks here with us on site. Okay, with that, I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Tricia Matthew.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Race and Regency Lab launch. I am so thrilled to see you. I'm probably going to get emotional. I'm so excited to have you here for a project that I hope will make a meaningful intervention, not only in how we understand Regency culture, its original iteration and its long-lasting hold on storytellers and readers, but how we talk about how we understand the Regency. I'm deeply grateful to Karen Wolf's generous offer to host the launch, and not just host the launch, but our advisory board meetings over the last 2 days. I'm grateful to her for hosting me in January when I could come and meditate with the map that we're going to be talking about today. I'm grateful to the staff, the very patient, detail-oriented, kind, focused staff. I talk a lot about diversity and inclusion in other spaces, and to make people who are not part of your institution feel welcome, to treat them as if their work matters, even when the work is still happening before it reaches its zenith, is really a huge testimony to the way that the JCB wants to embrace an entire new community. So thank you, Karen, thank you, Gianna, thank you, Catherine Goldman, thank you, Bertie Mandelblatt, thank you to all of the amazing AV people who sort of seem like little Disney characters almost, like factory workers making everything happen so easily. Probably not the best metaphor. Anyway. So over the course of the afternoon, I'm going to tell you about the lab, how it came about, what we've been doing in our incubation year, and what we hope to do next. About me, I'm a specialist in the history of the novel, particularly in this moment that overlaps for literary scholars. I work in Romantic era fiction. I think about 18th century literature. I'm as likely to be writing about Mary Shelley and Maria Edgeworth as I am Jane Austen. The first book I edited was a volume on diversity called Written Unwritten, Diversity and the Hidden Truths of Tenure. And so I've had a pretty interesting academic path, and what that means is that a lot of people know me as an expert on diversity and inclusion. I'm a series editor for Oxford University Press. I co-edit a series with Manu Chander called Race in 19th Century Culture. I'm editing 3 volumes, 3 different Jane Austen novels, even though I'm not a huge Austen fan. The irony just swells. Mansfield Park for Norton Classic editions, and then 2 Penguin Random House editions of Pride and Prejudice and Northanger Abbey. I also write for the public and think out loud about things like Bridgerton, not just the steamy parts, Sanditon. I've written for The Atlantic, Lapham's Quarterly, the Times Literary Supplement. I'm currently working on a book. It's at the center of everything I do, is an interdisciplinary book that analyzes novels, poems, portraiture, decorative objects, and historical writing about Britain's abolitionist era. And I think about them in the context of contemporary Black art. I'm writing that for Princeton University Press. I had an unexpected series of fellowships. I teach at Montclair State University. We carry a heavy teaching load. And I won 3 years of fellowship funding back to back to back. I came back for a year, and now I've won a 4th year. My dean's like, I'll see you sometime. I was at SUNY Buffalo as part of their diversity initiative, the Center for Diversity Innovations, Diversity Fellows Program, and then I was invited to stay as an assistant professor, a visiting associate professor for a 2nd year. I then won a fellowship to the National Humanities Center. My goal during that time was to read and draft my book. I ran a dialogue series about race and Romanticism. I edited a special issue of Studies in Romanticism. At the back of my mind, I wanted to think about a project that would bring all of the things that I do under an umbrella to serve the public and to think of new ways to serve the profession. I was really honored to be named an editor for Oxford University Press. Manu and I put a proposal forward. Our first books are coming out this year and next year. And in our conversation and our dialogue with our editor there, I said, you can't just put brown people in charge of a series and call it diverse. We have to think about how we support academics of color, emerging scholars, scholars who are not at well-heeled institutions. We have an entire community of contingent faculty who need support for their research projects. And so I asked them to think alongside me about things that we could do to support scholarship. I always concerned about the contingent crisis, not just because of the material reality of it, but the very important research that I worry gets lost as people don't have institutional stability. I was inspired by Gabriel Forman, Martha Jones, and Christina Sharp in the foundational work of Race Before Race, and so I developed the idea of the Race and Regency Lab. I was in the National Humanities Center in my study, and I was thinking about what it would look like if we all came together in places and in ways that felt organic. I didn't want it to be event-specific, but to be guided by curiosity, interest, what's happening in popular culture, and how we could prepare a new generation of scholars, not to just do work for us, which I think is very important, but also to do work for the public. I immediately wanted to put together an advisory board, and I made my wish list of people. I wanted a mix of senior women leaders whose leadership style and engagement made sense to me. I wanted peers who were leading their own programs and institutions who could help me figure that out. I wanted to work with scholars and freelance writers who regularly work for the public. I made my dream list, and I forgot to make a backup list, and then all the people on the dream list said no. Said yes. Sorry. No one said no. No one said no. So that's Patricia Akimi, Carol Bell, Manu Chander, Kim Hall, Paula Krebs, Devaney Lozier, Caroline McCaffrey Howarth, Joseph Resnick, Ayanna Thomas, and Karen Wolf. And they have guided me through this incubation year, so if you could thank them with me right now, I'd really appreciate it. We needed money. We needed support. So I applied for a New Jersey Council for the Humanities grant. And at every stage of this process, someone has said, I know you're thinking about this, and that's really great. Let me help you think long-term and do this. So I was going to apply for a small grant to do an event. I talked to a grants officer, and they said, why don't you apply for an incubation grant so that you can learn how to run a lab and figure out what the public wants and needs before you start throwing programming at them. You can see all of the different sponsors here. I want to say a special thank you to the British Association for Romantic Studies. They helped fund the intern that Boston University Center for the Humanities funded for our summer. You'll hear from Constanza later, and all of our different colleagues and partners. We won a spot in a planning retreat in North Carolina, and we all went for 4 days to talk about what the lab might do, to learn how to work together. There was a combination of daydreaming, strategizing, sharing resources, mentoring. Maybe I cried a little bit. We were allowed to bring 6 people. Kim Hall attended virtually, but we were all in the room together. And I just want to tell you something about Karen Wolf, who runs this amazing center. We were on a bus at night going to the National Humanities Center, which is in the woods, and I looked at her and I said, "You seem like somebody who always has really clean, nice towels." And that's exactly who she is, in deed and in spirit, in everything that she does. So the lab responds to 2 trends. One is the need for conversations beyond the academy devoted to thinking about race and representation with more inclusive methodologies. It also responds to the vibrant energy sparked by current interest in how race operated in the 19th century. Although the Regency period technically is quite short, most of us in the room understand the Regency is that period between 1811 and 1820 when the Prince Regent ruled. Its cultural footprint spans the entire 19th century, and it remains an obsession of scholars, artists, and the general public. It's the time of Jane Austen, it's the moment of dandies, tea parties, the London season, and leisure time at fashionable watering holes. I use that term for a few reasons, the Regency. I think it resonates with the public as a mood or a vibe, and not only because of the years of the Regency. I think it's a nod, I see it as a nod to the millions of readers, mostly women, who read Regency romance novels, and they did so before it was cool, hip, or on Netflix. I believe that adding race to the notion of Regency will invite us to pause and to think about the things we take for granted and the things we need to reevaluate. So our goal, and you can see it at raceandregency.org if you're online or if you want to look on your phones, I want us to broaden and deepen our understanding of the Regency by considering it along constructions of race in the era. Doing so expands it thematically, geographically, and temporally. This expansion shifts the focus from the myth of a homogeneous Britain to a global understanding of its impact in the past and how we engage with it now. I believe, after 7 years and countless diversity talks to faculty, deans, department chairs, and provosts, that real thinking about inclusion only happens when communities come together to talk about what we watch, what we read, and how we imagine our lives in relationship to the past. I want the Race and Regency Lab to incubate innovative ways to foster these intimate and vitally important conversations. I have been a professor at Montclair State for 20 years, and my students and their curiosity brought me to the question of race in this period. Their questions and debates had me rethinking my approach to how I teach literature, and that in turn had me thinking about how I work with new objects, a teapot, a painting, the map that we're going to see today. For me, this launch is seeing all the ways that my brain works manifest in real people, some of whom I talk to in my brain, even when they're not there. Kim Hall, you're in that room. And my hope is that our launch today will show the work we have done, how we imagine talking about complicated and interesting issues, and what we might do in the future. So we'll hear from historians, we'll hear from curators, we'll hear from art historians, we'll hear from literary scholars. We're going to hear from the great Nikki Payne, who has written 2 Austen adaptations that feature contemporary communities of color. Sex, Lives, and Sensibility is so good. I live in Brooklyn. I was reading it in Fort Greene Park, laughing out loud. I did not look cool. I looked like a crazed woman sitting on a bench. I'll introduce the first panel, and then they'll talk for a while. Then there'll be a Q&A, we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and talk some more. So you might want to come out now. Patricia Akimi is director of the Folger, you can come and take a seat, is director of the Folger Institute at the Folger Shakespeare Library. She also serves as director of the Race Before Race Mentoring Network and is an associate professor of English at Rutgers University, Newark. She is the author of Shakespeare and the Cultivation of Race, Race and Conduct in the Early Modern World,
editor of the Oxford Handbook of Shakespeare and Race, and co-editor of Travel and Travail, Early Modern Women, English Drama, and the Wider World. Dr. Akimi is currently working on a new edition of Othello for the Art and Shakespeare fourth series and a monograph about race, gender, and the editing of early modern text. Her research has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Folger Shakespeare Library, the John Carter Brown Library, and Ford Foundation. Dr. Caroline McCaffrey Howarth is an art historian and curator specializing in the visual and material cultures of early modern Europe. She's a lecturer in French and British history of art from 1650 to 1900, specializing in material culture and design. Caroline was previously curator of the 1600 to 1800 ceramic and glass at the V&A Museum and lecturer in history of design for the Royal College of Art. She is currently writing 2 books, one of which she's sent off to press, one on the art of collector and philanthropist, Lady Charlotte Schreibner, and a forthcoming monograph on Sèvres, the craft of ceramics connoisseurship. She's a trustee of the French Porcelain Society, the English Ceramic Circle, and the Furniture History Society. She's also a freeman of the City of London for the Worshipful Company of Art Scholars. She's written for a number of museums, exhibitions, private collections. I could go on. Simon Newman, thank you, Dr. Newman, began his career writing about popular political culture and social history in the era of the American Revolution. For the past 15 years, he has focused on the history of slavery in the British Atlantic, publishing a book on the origins of the plantation labor system. He led a Leverhulme Trust Fund project creating a database of runaway slave advertisements published in 18th century Britain, and his research has resulted in collaborations with playwrights, musical composers, filmmakers, and a graphic novelist. In 2018, he published the William and Mary Quarterly's Firstborn digital article. His research also focuses on freedom seekers, those enslaved, people who resisted by escaping. He recently published a book on freedom seekers in the 17th century London. I believe there's a link on our website, and the origins of the quote-unquote runaway slave. We'll hear from Caroline and Patricia. They'll talk for a little bit, talk about their work, then we'll hear from Dr. Newman, and then we'll take Q&A. Thank you for being here.
Let's make sure this is on. It's on. Well, we were going to start this off by talking a little bit about the sort of raison d'etre for the Race and Regency Lab, which is about race, trust, and the archive, which was also the topic of our planning retreat, which happened in North Carolina last year. So we were going to start by talking about the barriers to building trust, the barriers to the archive itself, but also the barriers to building trust, and to reconstructing race within those archives. So let's talk about the bad stuff. Yeah, let's start. You start. Yeah.
Okay. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Trisha, for that incredibly eloquent introduction to the lab. And it's been a pleasure to be involved in this. I think one of the key things that came through from our sort of workshop session in North Carolina last year was thinking about the responsibility of the institution and the multiple communities that they serve, whether that is the public or it is situated within the academy, and how Race and Regency could act within that, but also have agency to a sense of urgency to actually enact change. So I think for me, when I think about a barrier, okay, first of all, we're all going to talk about money straight away, and that came through, immediately through this project. But it's also the responsibility of the institution to create trust with the public that it says it wants to serve, and actually have a two-way kind of dialogue or a two-way conversation to create and construct that trust in a meaningful manner. So it's a useful starting point, hopefully.
I think it absolutely is, especially because we're sitting here in the John Carter Brown Library, which, like the institution where I work, the Folger Shakespeare Library, was originally constructed to sort of convey a sense of exclusivity that was part of the esteem that it built. And I had a moment walking in earlier today where I hesitated at the last step before the door because it's an imposing door, and I haven't stepped through it in more than a decade. And I thought, do I have do I have enough credentials actually to walk into this building? I think I do. I think I do now. But that moment of hesitation, I think, was that kind of muscle memory that many of us who have worked as scholars in academia are familiar with, in which you feel that you must prove that you are worthy of entering the archive, of working within it, of working with its materials. And I think that if you have had years of opportunities to cross that threshold and do that again and again, it gets easier over time. But when we're talking about engaging with a much wider public, that is one really big initial obstacle, is to say, how do we say, come in?
Yeah.
How do we say, don't worry about not knowing for sure what you're going to do when you get on the other side of the door. It's going to be all right. You're welcome here.
Yeah.
Is a big barrier.
Yeah, absolutely. It just literally the accessibility of walking through an imposing building made of white stone, columns, marble, whatever it might be, and how you feel within that space, and also feeling how you should, how should you act in that space? Well, who decides, right? Who tells us how we should act within that? Yeah. Absolutely. And also, what do we mean by archive? I think that's something that is really great about the interdisciplinarity that's at the key of Race and Regency, is that we're dealing with a very broad brushstroke of what the archive can be. The archive can be the building itself, the documents within that building, the objects within that building. There's kind of a multi-layer to the archive as well.
And the people themselves.
And the people themselves,
Yeah.
and the stories, the histories that are connected to that too.
That's right. Which Trisha described earlier, the way that people engage with the books that they read, even if they don't know that they're cool or that they have great critical significance or they're on Netflix in an adaptation, that they also are themselves an archive.
Yeah. How do you think then, from your perspective at the Folger, in terms of engaging the public with the archive, can you say a little bit about how you've been doing that, or how the Folger has been doing that?
Yes, we have been trying really hard at the Folger to think about how to make the resources that we have available accessible to a wider range of people. And so one of the ways that we're doing that at the Folger is thinking about some of the structures that have been there for a long time. Like we have a fellowships program. The JCB has one as well. How could we make the fellowship something that seemed achievable and accessible to a lot more people? And so some of our conversations were as simple as, who isn't applying for our fellowships? And why aren't they applying for them? And one of the answers right away was, well, people who have very heavy teaching loads. They're faculty members, they have research, they want to do it. But getting a leave for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months is not a possibility. About scholars who have young children, families, or other caregiving responsibilities for elders in their family or adults with disabilities. How are they going to take off 3, 6, 8, 9 months to come and hang out in Washington, D.C.? So we started thinking about the pandemic was helpful for this because it gave us a good shove in that direction. How could we make our fellowships hybrid? To give options, make them flexible, offer fully virtual fellowships. Do you really need to step through that door into the marble, the columned colonnades? Or might it be possible for us to envision other kinds of ways of engaging with an archive? And we have been stunned by the results of even making small changes. First of all, number of applicants quadrupled. And the fellows who have taken up our invitation to imagine a different way of engaging are doing incredible work, and it has not made us any less. It has not made their research outputs any less to have our involvement look different. So that's one simple way that we can do that. But what I really want you to hear about is the work that Caroline has been doing, because it's one thing to make scholarships flexible for folks who already think of themselves as researchers and scholars. How do we engage with an even wider public who is not going to apply for a fellowship because they're not interested in doing that? So tell us a little bit about your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, one of the key things comes back to actually having an opportunity to create dialogue with the public and whatever that means. So I'm a curator, but I'm also an art historian. So everything I kind of do comes back to this focus on the visual material culture around us and how we think about the historic stuff and make it relevant today, like really, really in a simplistic manner. So in terms of race and regency, I've spent a lot of time thinking about ceramics, which were produced in Europe, but primarily in Britain in the latter half of the 18th and the early part of the 19th century. And a huge number of these are aestheticizing, kind of commodifying the enslaved body and turning it into something which is ornamental, which is a decorative object made out of pottery or porcelain that is effectively there to hold sugar or spice or tea or coffee, right? So types of things which are absolutely products of slavery. And you have this real connection with the ceramics that are being produced at this time to then sit on mantelpieces or dinner tables, dessert tables that are then being handled by white hands of the elite, particularly in the British society, and the kind of relationship that exists between these two things happening. And at this point, the key thing with the ceramics industry is that they want to achieve perfect whiteness in their porcelain. But they're doing this to then also have the sculptural form, oh, brilliant, of, so for example, I have an image, sorry, I'm being the typical art historian in the room. I had to show an object with an image. But I just wanted to point two things out to you. I'm going to come back to this particular image. These are some lovely students I've recently worked on a huge project with in London, and I'm going to talk a little bit in a minute. But you will hopefully notice, the eager-eyed among you, that this is the same type of object. It's not the exact same object. So the one on the right-hand side is now the MFA in Boston. This is a white porcelain English London factory called Bow Porcelain Factory. It was made in the late 1750s, and it is bone china, and it is featuring, it's a sugar bowl featuring an enslaved woman. She is nude, she is coded in a very particular way using very homogeneous, westernized, colonialized perspectives of the African body, of the enslaved body, to hold refined white sugar, right? So this connection is incredibly explicit. And because so many of these were produced, these types of objects exist across the world in collections and art museums. Sometimes they're on display and there aren't any kind of conversations or dialogues happening with these objects. Myself and lots of other colleagues across the globe are really trying to kind of think through the processes of the racialization of ceramics, to think through the racial terminology that we use to describe and engage with these objects. However, there are still museums today that take these kinds of objects off display. They don't even want to have the conversation. They are erasing the reality of what's being created, what's being constructed at this point. So kind of coming back to your original question, sorry, it took me a while to get there, but when we think about reconstructing race through materiality or through something very specific like a British ceramic sugar bowl, we have to actually have these objects on display and be attempting to engage with them and through curatorial critique, but also through curiosity, through sometimes trialing and making mistakes and not getting it right, but at least doing something rather than perhaps removing it from display. So one of the ways I've been trying to do this is actually talking to young people, 16, 17, and 18-year-olds, to really engage them in thinking about these objects and why should they care about this kind of white porcelain decorative piece of art. So Bow Porcelain was based in East London. So I work with students at schools in Bow today. So they were handling objects like you see on the screen from the factory that existed where they live, their place, their like local region, where they go to school from 200 plus years ago to actually go, this was history happening here. Your area was implicated in global kind of transatlantic slavery, but also in kind of links to cosmopolitanism, commodities, all of this happening. And one of the kind of key things that we did with this project was have the students in the V&A. Some of them felt that was really daunting. For the majority of them, this is their first time ever coming into a museum like that. But we also did workshops in the schools so we could actually kind of, again, have that sense of trust and that sense of dialogue to come together and and have the opportunity to have really meaningful conversations. And the key thing I really wanted to do is actually get them to hold things, because these are objects, this is stuff that you're meant to be able to touch, that material encounter, the haptic experience that you get from that. And so this is the image that you're seeing here on the screen of the first object handling session that we did with this object, to really feel the weight, to feel how it was, to look at the materiality of the piece, to think about the whiteness in particular. And just one of the students said this, and I've just got the quote on the screen, but because I found it incredibly profound, and they said, we can't change our past, so it's important that we talk about it. And that's why we're here today, right? The race and Regency, they're all connected together. We ended up co-curating an exhibition with these objects with the students. We remade objects, we remade using 18th century porcelain recipes. And one of the kind of key things I think with that was not just only trust, but it was their curiosity, my curiosity. We were kind of all in a room together doing this project within a museum, but also within the school space itself. So actually being out in the community, out with the public, to co-create and co-produce like a new form of knowledge that's, yeah, I think it's not just serving the public, it's actually inviting the public in a meaningful way.
It's really incredible. I can imagine that that's the kind of experience that would impact someone for a lifetime. And having had the chance to do that, you would remember it always, and that the museum itself would become a very different place to you than it had been before you had that experience.
Yeah.
And that's what's really impressive to me. I hope we can do even half as much at the Folger.
Yeah, no, hopefully. I think it's a really important thing, as you say, to do that together. Yeah. Do we stop? I don't know how we're doing on time.
Yeah.
Should we stop there? Yeah, sorry, I went on a bit. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
Come on, Simon.
I'm a social historian, so if you'll forgive me, I'm going to give you a practical example, because that's what I do. And I was inspired by the map that we're going to hear about and look at later, the Belvedere plantation in the 1770s. And I thought, what if I can see if I can find someone from that plantation during the Regency era, what I can find out about them. So that's what I've done. Her parents were still young, and she wasn't born when that map was made, 1772. At that time, I think it very likely that her parents lived in West Central Africa in a matrilineal and largely rural society in the Kingdom of Congo. It was a large society, both geographically and numerically, although there was some mining of copper, iron, and gold, and the industries associated with that. Most people worked in a remarkably diversified agriculture. Included corn, manioc, peanuts, sweet potatoes, pineapples, bananas, peppers, sugarcane, and palm oil. The number of New World crops there shows you how connected this world was. Women did much of the agricultural labor, and perhaps the woman who concerns us became familiar with this work during her early years. But at some point she, perhaps with other members of her family and community, was taken up and sold to traders and transported to Jamaica. In the nearly 2 decades between her birth in about 1790 and the end of the legal slave trade in 1808, almost 200 ships brought about 60,000 people from her region, West Central Africa, to Jamaica alone. That's almost a quarter of all of the Africans brought to the island during those years. Kitty Thompson was one of them. Now, of course, that wasn't the name her parents gave her. It's the name that identifies her in documents in the National Archives in Kew in London, the Essex Record Office in Chelmsford, and in issues of 2 Jamaican newspapers, the Cornwall Chronicle and the Royal Gazette. We don't know how old she was when she was enslaved and endured the Middle Passage, nor do we know who purchased her upon arrival and where she then worked. For a while, she worked as an enslaved person on a small coffee plantation called Newfield. That's in the parish of St. Thomas in the East, which is in southeastern Jamaica, on the higher ground between the coast and the Blue Mountains. But that almost certainly wasn't her first place of enslavement. Kitty Thompson was no longer at Newfield when she appeared in a list of enslaved people who were confined in the Kingston workhouse. This was published in the Cornwall Chronicle in October 1816. The entry is short, naming and describing her as Kitty, a Mongola to Belvedere Estate. The record also reveals that she was marked with several branded initials on her left shoulder. Now, Jamaican newspapers at this point were required by law to publish lists of all enslaved people who had escaped and were incarcerated in workhouses and jails, as well as all others in those institutions who'd been sent to them for punishment for various offenses, perhaps to be whipped or made to work in harsh conditions away from their plantation community. The words next to Kitty Thompson's name, to Belvedere Estate, indicate that she fell into this latter category. The plantation authorities had sent her there for punishment. So the very first record we have of her is one that indicates she resisted to the extent that she faced serious punishment. Being sent to the workhouse usually occurred after several offenses and punishments on the plantation. Often running away was one of them. A year later, in 1817, her name appears in an inventory of the enslaved people at Belvedere, which is today held in the Essex Records Office in Chelmsford in England. Hers was a simple entry recording her name, that she was 28 years old, and that she was African-born. It's clear that she was part of a large community at this plantation. The inventory listed a total of 355 enslaved people, 182 male, 173 female, all of them living and working. 80 of those aged 23 or older were, like Kitty Thompson, African-born. But when those who were younger are included, Africans constituted less than a quarter of Belvedere's enslaved population. She was the youngest African-born female on the plantation, and we can wonder about how that must have felt. Many of the estate's enslaved people were listed with the names of partners, mothers, or children alongside them, but no name appeared alongside hers in any of the surviving lists. Now, that doesn't mean she didn't have a connection of any kind. For example, she may have had a partner on a neighboring plantation, but seeing her name alone again and again is very suggestive. 5 years would pass before Kitty Thompson's name once again appeared. In July of 1822, an advertisement in the Cornwall Chronicle described and offered rewards for the capture and return of 2 enslaved people who had escaped from Belvedere. The short notice first described a male freedom seeker who'd run away a few days earlier, then identified Kitty Thompson as having been absent from Belvedere since August 1820, a period of almost 2 years. The advertisement describes her as an African and mentioned that she is supposedly harbored in Kingston. Home to the island's largest free black population, as well as many enslaved people, Kingston provided cover for a significant number of freedom seekers who were able to disguise their status. Perhaps like other Jamaican freedom seekers, she sought out people who came from the same region as her, perhaps even the same community. Now, the Jamaican Slave Code made clear that long-term escape was a serious offense. Enslaved people who escaped and remained free for up to 6 months would appear before justices of the peace and would usually be severely whipped, and we're talking about up to 100 lashes, put to hard labor for 3 months, and even sold and transported off the island. Those people, like Kitty Thompson, who'd been absent for more than 6 months, would also appear before the justices, and, being thereof convicted, shall suffer death, or such punishment as the courts think proper to direct. That was usually mutilation and even more severe whipping, or again, banishment. Long-term escape was defined by white lawmakers as rebellion, and it was punished as such. I found only one more record identifying Kitty Thompson, the 1823 slave register for the parish of St. Thomas in the East, and that's in the National Archives in London. Her name appears near the end of the list of enslaved women and girls, and after her name, she was described as Negro, meaning dark-skinned in this context, African-born and age 33. But it's the final column that is most revealing. The column's headed Decrease and Cause Thereof, and entries record, for example, that the named person had been sold or that they died from maladies ranging from tetanus to dropsy to fever. In this column, next to Kitty Thompson's name, we learn that she had been shipped off-country by the slave court. Recaptured after being free for 2 years or more, she'd been brought before the slave court and sentenced to be transported and sold elsewhere, far from the community and perhaps even families she may have had in Jamaica. Between 1807 and 1833, more than 1,000 enslaved people were sentenced by Jamaican slave courts to be transported and sold elsewhere. She was one of them. Neither the court records nor the relevant shipping records survive, so we don't know where she was sent. However, most were sent to Cuban ports like Havana, Trinidad, Bayamo, and Santiago de Cuba. And this is probably Kitty Thompson's fate. Not only did she face a new enslaver, language, culture, and religion, but she was entering a slave society containing a significantly lower percentage and number of people from her native region of Africa. So for me, many of the challenges facing us in exploring Black agency and white colonial archives are illustrated by the few surviving records referring to Kitty Thompson. We know of her existence only through these documents created by enslavers or their agents. And these records defined her by obliterating her African identity and heritage, marking her with the initials of the white men who claimed ownership of her, renaming her, forcing her to work in coffee and sugar production, and finally exiling her. How do we imagine the individual behind and beyond this violent reconstruction of her identity? Can we? The inner lives, the personalities, histories, and culture of African and African-descended people were obscured and deemed illegitimate and irrelevant in the surviving records. And yet, there is an inherent tension in these dusty old white-created documents, for they all refer to her resistance. The first indicates that she had been placed in the workhouse for unspecified offenses, but quite likely running away. Others indicate that she had escaped and remained at liberty. In short, for all that the records indicate violent ownership and enslavement, they simultaneously reveal that Kitty Thompson constantly resisted her situation. Behind the short, cold words, we can perhaps sense a powerful personality, a fierce and determined resistance to the objectification inherent in these records and the enslavement that they described. This was a woman who rebelled time and time again, who freed herself for much of the period covered by the documents, and who was exiled from Jamaica as a result. Scholars like Saidiya Hartman warn us that we can never presume to know enslaved people like Kitty Thompson. In her groundbreaking essay, Venus in Two Acts, Hartman writes of another enslaved woman and observes, "One cannot ask who is Venus." She goes on to say, because it would be impossible to answer that question. How, she asks, can narrative embody life in words and at the same time respect what we cannot know? How does one listen for the groans and cries, the undecipherable songs, the crackle of fire in the cane fields, the laments for the dead, and the shouts of victory, and then assign words to all of it? She's right, and that's the challenge that faces us, to represent lives that never can be known, refusing to abandon them in the anonymity of white records, while acknowledging that people who were enslaved will always remain just out of our sight. As a historian, I can imagine, but I can never know why an African woman like Kitty Thompson resisted her enslavement so fiercely and at such cost. The archive tells us she resisted, but no more. And yet that is a lot. When we examine the faded words, we cannot fail to see the violent power of white enslavers in faded blank ink on the yellowed paper. But for me, it's Kitty Thompson's fierce independence and resistance that echoes loudest across the century.
Are we allowed? Okay.
You're allowed.
Simon, could I ask you a question? So what you just shared with us was that was initial research based on your interaction with the map?
Yes.
And will you just tell us a little bit about actually the research that you did? Actually, how did you do it?
I started with Jamaican newspapers that have been digitized because I didn't have access to large, complete runs. The largest collection in this country is at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, but they've been digitized. And then looked for the Belvedere plantation and found people. And then when I found people who occurred more than once, who were in the right period, because I wanted it to be about the Regency period, then tried to find out if there were any other records. And through reading secondary works and looking through digital archives like British History Online. And I knew that I could probably get listings of enslaved people. Most of those have been digitized. The ones that from 1817, I think, all Caribbean plantations have to have annual reports of all the enslaved people which are returned to London. Most of those survive. Ancestry have digitized them all. So I have a subscription to Ancestry, so it's behind a paywall, but that's where I found other records of her.
Is it liberating? How does it feel to do this kind of research? What feelings does it bring up in you as you move through?
Many. I don't think there's a simple answer to that. It's incredibly frustrating to be looking for people who I can never know. But this speaks to what you've been doing in your work in the schools, and I've done similar work, is I've begun to think of myself as a historian as not producing the final word in what I write and publish, but as creating information that can be used by other people, by school learners, by filmmakers, by playwrights, by artists, by poets, because these stories are inspiring, they're fascinating, and because we don't know, people want to know, and people want to imagine. As a historian, I'm limited in how far I can go with that, but not everyone is. So that can be very exciting to hand it over.
I suppose that brings into this idea of actually engaging the public with that as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, and opening up those dialogues. Because as you say, the archive maybe will only ever get you so far in these histories, but actually what else, through a creative or an artistic response or whatever else it may be. Yeah. Really fascinating work. Any questions?
This microphone on? Yes, it is. Hi. Please speak into the microphone. I'll bring it to you because we have people in the Zoom room. So.
Hi. My name is Nikki Payne, and I have a comment, and I don't know if I'll get around to a question. I think it's very classic. First, I think what you all are doing is amazing, and what I was thinking about in bridging this gap between like trust in the archives and building an identity through archival retrieval is there's this aspect. I was teaching a course on medical anthropology, and these students were going through kind of old medical terminology, and there was this disease and disorder from a very well-established medical journal called drapetomania. And it is essentially the pathologizing an African's desire to escape slavery and turning it into a medical disorder and disease. And I'm just thinking about like the way that people chronicled the instances and cases of drapetomania and the way that those instances of resistance were categorized in pathologies in the similar way that these are penal codes and sale receipts, right? That you're able to cobble together a history. And just like the physicality of the archives brings, again, not a question, but it's just bringing this idea together about how you can build, how identities are built through these whispers of memories that you have to cobble together. That's all.
That's such a powerful experience for your students, but it makes me think about when you have those kinds of moments, when you're being introduced to archival work and you have those kinds of moments, you also have the thought, oh, I wonder who's watching me. I wonder who is chronicling and pathologizing, potentially, my hopes and dreams.
We have questions over here. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, thank you all. This is such a wonderful panel, and thank you, Patricia, for organizing this. Oh, I'm Nicole Aljo from Northeastern University in Boston. I'm inspired by a phrase that Simon actually used in my question. So it's Black agency in white colonial archives. And I was wondering if you all might want to riff on that question of agency and Black agency specifically and how you are seeing it. Anything along those lines would be great to hear. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think the challenge is that Black agency in the archives I'm looking at is by definition defined almost always as criminal and illegal. And so you begin with a deeply flawed record if you're looking for agency in the way you and I might want to interrogate it. So from the very start, you're reading against the grain of the archive. And that's challenging, but it's also, again, when it comes to working with students on this sort of thing, that's very exciting because they've often been taught simply to draw material from an archive or a document in a very staid, traditional fashion, and to say, you can't trust this document you have to read beyond it. You have to look for a person who is deliberately being misunderstood and obscured here. Is actually quite exciting, or it can be. So it's very challenging, but I think it's also, we have to come to think of it as an opportunity as much as a challenge. Maybe that's too optimistic, but I have to work that way.
I suppose it's really about who has constructed that archive or that collection that's in that museum and who made those decisions and why. Yeah.
What are you doing at the Folger these days? Because it's interesting stuff.
Well, actually, this is something we're talking about a lot right now, and we have a season coming up where the focus will actually be on, we're doing seasons now, Simon, it's changed. So our season is on Shakespeare and Black women. And that was a very conscious choice because it would be an understatement to describe it as difficult to research the histories of Black women in an archive of colonialism, to use the phrase that Karen mentioned. That is a very difficult thing to do. And that is for very specific structural reasons. And it is no less true in Shakespeare studies than anywhere else. And so we thought, well, what if we met that challenge head on and said, let's take a minute to look at this archive that we're the stewards of in a different way, through a different lens, and see what becomes visible. And then let's make it a point to have that be a conversation between the Folger itself, which is a very traditional, kind of esteemed institution in DC, but let's open that conversation up to have it with the city that we live in, with Washington, DC, which has a very large population of African Americans and has had for many centuries. And to make that part of what the Folger is and what it does for its city as a cultural institution. Now, I'm making it sound like that's easy. It's actually not. It's really hard, and it involves a lot of tough conversations internally and externally, but it feels really worthwhile, and it feels very validating, especially because I know that many scholars have faced that challenge of trying to do the type of research that you do, Simon, that you do, Caroline, and have found it difficult to pursue that work in lots of different archives of various kinds. So we're just excited to try. We're going to do our best.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, we have two more questions for now from the audience, and then I'll go to the chat after that. Okay, so.
Thank you. My name's Caretha Mitchell. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a professor of English at Boston University these days. It is so amazing to be here to celebrate what you've done, Tricia. I'm just thrilled to be in the room. Thank you all for everything. This is really just a comment, and I couldn't resist making it given the comment about drapetomania and then Black agency. Because part of what I found so striking about the framework of resistance is that it keeps us from focusing on the very deliberate violence that's enacted by those who socialize themselves as white. So part of what I wanted to offer is what would happen if what we were thinking about wasn't resistance, but instead, asserting one's humanity, being human, living out one's God-given humanity, but always encountering a backlash of violence that tried to deny that humanity. In other words, it's the success of knowing I'm not property that prompts all of this. So we get drapetomania because let me criminalize, as you said, let me criminalize the fact that you know you're human, that you don't believe you're property. Let me criminalize your agency. Anyway, I couldn't resist saying that given the way that this line of questioning came, like what would happen to our methodologies if we thought in terms of the success of knowing that I'm human and not property and the violence that is constantly enacted not only by those historical actors, but also by the archives that you so elegantly described.
That's really well put, and I agree completely with you. I think it's so challenging because most of the time This woman only appears in the records because she challenged that violence with resistance. And you're right, it's an assertion of humanity. And I think those kinds of assertions of humanity and personhood are happening every day in all kinds of small ways. And one of the things that's fascinating about the map over there is it makes you start thinking about, well, okay, if these provision grounds that individual enslaved people are farming, what are the conversations going on there? What is the experience there in a space that they're trying to define and shape themselves and create an economy for themselves in Jamaica? By the end of the 18th century, most of the coinage in Jamaica, hard money, coins rather than paper money, was held by enslaved people. There's a huge economy that they have created, both legally and illegally. We know so little about it, about the lives they're creating for themselves. So I couldn't agree more. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to just say one thing that I'm excited about in thinking about humanity and archives is about collecting and about donors. Now that I live in this world of what is an archive except it is like this one, a library like this one, except a repository for the collection, the collected donations of human beings who thought things were important and gathered them unto themselves and then gave them away. And I thought, I could donate something. But I say it out loud to encourage everyone to maybe start thinking of themselves that way, that we're not just the recipients of archives as scholars or as members of the public, we are also the makers of archives and the deciders of what will be retained, preserved, conserved, and shared in the future. And you can be sassy about it. Donate what you think should be there, which I've been doing.
Okay, one other question from the floor. Please introduce yourself, and then Evan, get ready for a question from the chat. Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Sam. I go to school at Rhode Island College. First, I'd like to thank you guys for opening the panel to the public. I think you guys did a good job with the presentation. You kind of answered my question, a little bit of my question earlier. You were talking about seasons and how you're moving forward in the future with Shakespeare and Black women. I wanted to ask, how do you plan on incorporating some of African culture and African folktale in your upcoming seasons? Because, like you said, colonialism and European models have predominantly taken over education. How do you seek to reach to the youth and show some of our culture and our past folklore, even if some may have got lost in the archives? We do a lot of oral telling, so how do you plan on incorporating those in your upcoming seasons?
Well, I can tell you, we've already started. And one of the ways we're able to do that is that we're lucky enough at the Folger to have a theater. Part of the Folger is the Folger Theater. And so we are able to put on full productions. And our most recent production was an adaptation of Ovid's Metamorphosis. And the story was retold with an all-Black cast, and it focused on a sort of pre-diasporic moment of mythology. And it was an amazing production, but it was amazing not least because Ovid is one of those touchstone authors that we talk about in Shakespeare studies as a canonical influence on Shakespeare and other literature from that period. This was a very different way of talking about Ovid, and it was in a space that had not seen a production of that kind in its lifetime as a theater. And so that was really incredible. And from where I'm sitting, that is the beginning of what we can do. And we are planning an amazing season of theater to go along with exhibitions in our public galleries, which didn't used to exist, and now they do. And so I hope you will come and visit and see what you think of how good a job we do.
Okay, Evan. Evan is manning the chat here. Is there any questions in there?
We do not have any Zoom questions
Okay,
yet.
chat people, get up there on the chat. Please enter it into the Q&A function so that when I call on Evan next time, we've got a question from the chat. Okay, so here we are, everybody. Any other questions from the floor? Plenty of time. I, of course, always have a question I can ask while you wait. Okay, so I'm going to ask a question. So, magnificent panel. This is part of a magnificent project, obviously. I noticed 3 ways of reaching the public here. We have, you just mentioned theater. We have the objects, right, in the museum, getting them in front of people, letting students or maybe members of the general public even handle them. And then Simon told us a story, so narrative. So I just want to, that's very interdisciplinary. And I just want to, have you guys think about ways the Race and Regency Lab can reach the general public through different kinds of engagements, right? So no one's up there arguing with scholars, right? So this is, which is a relief, but obviously lots of, decades of scholarship is behind this lab as well. So just think about, different modes of reaching the public.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I'm trying to think how, for me, I think one of the things with Race and Regency is that it is saying that everyone should be talking. I wrote it down, Tricia said it better than me in her introduction, that we want the lab to be thinking out loud. She wants the lab to, everyone who's at a Race and Regency event, to be thinking out loud. And that means you don't necessarily have to have the right answer immediately or have a solution, sort of as you were saying, Simon, it's more working through the process. And for me, there are so many different visual material modes, artistic responses, as well as the hard and heavy archival, sat in the archives trawling through something for months on end, and you finally find that one thing, that one document you didn't even order, but it just happened to be in your box, or whatever it might be. Like, I think we need that balance of, you need the rigorous knowledge and scholarship and pedagogy and teaching, but you also need to have opportunities to create spaces where curiosity and creativity can thrive, so we can all think out loud together. That sounds really like utopian or something, but anyway, that's my thought, I suppose, on that.
Well, okay, so I'm going to channel Tricia too. And something Tricia says about Race and Regency Lab is that it's also about validating people's pleasure, which weirdly makes me uncomfortable. I think because I'm a critic and I'm like, no, we start by saying what's wrong with things, and then we, but the idea that part of what makes Regency is people's enthusiasm, people's fandom, people's love of the material and the materiality of the period, and that is a way to begin a conversation that is welcoming and generative. Now, I don't know how to do that, but the Race and Regency Lab does and will.
Okay, another question from the floor.
Sure, my name's Chris Roberts, assistant professor at Rhode Island School of Design and Art History. So questions primarily for Carolyn, but could be for Patricia as well, other folks. Really thinking about the ways that in, I guess you could say, traditional art history spaces, be they academic or museological, there's, I'd say, still an ongoing tension. I think history is a lot further in this realm than art history, I would say. I think most of the humanities are, whereas a continued valorization of formal analysis is sort of the pinnacle, kind of beginning and ending with what's inside the frame, and this idea that to sort of do, say, a social analysis or a contextual analysis, there are many that would say that that sort of is an anachronism or sort of sullies the work, or is, there's this ongoing conversation about the way that bringing this sort of social, the political, the contextual into art historical and formal analysis is not the work of art history. Many would say that you should begin and end with like the object and what it has, and that gets into theories around aesthetics and beauty and on and on and on. But the question there is, what has been your experience in bringing a sort of more grassroots, or we could say more communal lens to an art historical work, given that the discipline, again, I would say perhaps uniquely even than many other disciplines, has a very long way to go in this conversation. But thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think for me, as someone who specializes in early modern material culture, but predominantly I'm thinking about ceramics and glass, and I'm thinking about decorative objects, decorative art. And this phrase, there's an issue with that, because when we think of decorative, we think of ornamental or beautiful, and it's the aesthetics that's associated with that. We don't necessarily think of that as something which can be rigorously interrogated through like a theoretical standpoint. And I suppose everything I try to do by bringing it back to the object and its materiality, but also the life biography of that object. Even just these two objects, like the same thing in very vastly different contexts, can tell so many different stories, and someone can ask so many different questions about it. And so for me, I very much kind of have moved away from the very traditional art history of the paintings on the wall. And I suppose what I'm trying to do is think through kind of cultural history and social and political, and challenge this idea that these are decorative objects. Like, what does that even mean? And okay, they were decorative at that point, but actually there are problems around who was constructing that as something which is decorative, and who it was for, and what it was serving, and its function, and how all that's kind of bound up. I'm not really sure if I'm answering your question, but I have a lot of thoughts on this, so I'd like to chat more. But more generally, I think for me, these kind of interdisciplinary projects just help us push the boundaries of whatever we might think are the traditional ways of doing social history or art history or literary scholarship. And actually what Race and Regency does is puts all of us in the room together, and that can only be a good thing. It is a good thing, yeah.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Phoebe Labat, and I'm a PhD candidate here at Brown and also a JCB fellow this year. And thank you all for your talk today. And thank you for making the trip here. And speaking of like making trips, I noticed that kind of throughout what all of you guys were saying, there was this theme of like globality and kind of movement and mobility. And I was just thinking, and you also talked about the public a lot. And so I was just kind of thinking of how this kind of project can connect publics around the world, that, and that kind of harkens back to this transatlantic world, that where an enslaved woman from, an African woman from Africa was then transported to the other side of the ocean. And, you know, and yeah, and just goods like the porcelain bowl were sort of inspired by like atrocities in Jamaica. And so I just think, I was just wondering if you guys have thought about sort of almost recapturing, but in a better way, and a sort of this transatlantic community, I guess, and but also involving the public in it as well. Yeah. I hope that made sense.
I feel like that made a lot of sense. And I think I really like your way of looking at it, and I think I agree with you. What it brings to mind is that there's the possibility for a place like this, and congratulations on your fellowship. There's the possibility in a place like this to feel like things have come here and then they stop moving, that they've moved around the world, that they've encountered different people, that they've had object lives, and that their lives have ended, and this is the mausoleum or something for them. But it doesn't need it to actually be that way. And the work that we do here, including the work that you're doing, which I'd love to learn more about, continues the journey of those objects. And it's in continuing the journey of those objects that we're able to do to have the kinds of insights that we've been lucky enough to hear about today and will continue to hear about today for Simon and Caroline. And I think that is maybe the sort of underlying mission statement of being part of the administration of an archive like this one. At least it begins to be that for me, I think. But it's really helpful to be reminded of that.
Last question, and then Trisha will close us out. Here you go.
Hi, I'm Carol, and I'm part of this advisory board. Happy to be joining. We've sort of been joining for a while. I'm a culture critic, but my question is this. When I think of the Regency, I'm wondering, what does the public think of, and how do you think of it? What are the geographic borders when we're talking about, I feel like there's a phantom word in the title, Race in the Regency, and that people want to put the word England after that, but it's not, right? So what are the borders? And, I think it's really meaningful that we are here. I'm from Jamaica originally, and we're here, and, the star of the day, one of the stars of the day, apart from Patricia, who's amazing, is the map, and it's from where I am, right? It's of Jamaica, but so much of the experience of learning about the Regency is hearing about it in a way that is very much only rooted in England and very much only white. And so I'm just wondering, like, what do people think of? What do you hear about? Like, what does it mean to be studying race in the Regency? Like, what are those borders to you?
You want to take that one? I'm not real. I'm an early modernist.
I mean, I feel like we've already mentioned Bridgerton. I hate to bring it all back to sort of Bridgerton or kind of popular culture, specifically through TV, but it is something that I find with my students. I teach at University of Edinburgh, and I find that my students will make references even when we're talking about, very much within the early modern period, and perhaps they reference contemporary writers or artists, but so often they think back to the Duke, tasting the sugar and licking the spoon at the very start of Bridgerton. And we had a whole session thinking about ornamental blackness through Adrian Child's work and kind of the idea of sugar as a product of slavery. And that was the conversation starter. And we spoke for about 20 minutes about how everything in Bridgerton came back to sugar. And, that for me is maybe a cliched way of thinking about it, but actually if that's what students and the general public are, that's their first introduction to the Regency. And obviously, as we know, it's a very particular kind of stylized or constructed view of the Regency. But if we can at least grasp their attention through that, then we can, bring ourselves out to think about the macro and wider ideas here. I'm just dropping all my paper, sorry. But yeah, sorry, Simon, I don't know if you have other thoughts.
No, I would agree. And like Patricia, I'm an early modernist. The Regency is getting to the edge of the known world to me. But one of the things that I was at Glasgow for many years, so Bridgerton started while I was still living there. And I'm very aware of how contested this became in Britain. And it was a battle that was really fought in the National Trust, most visibly, where the National Trust very sensibly started to try and come to terms with how much, and a lot of this is Regency architecture and Regency buildings, and that's where the great wealth came into these country houses and buildings owned by the National Trust. There was an attempt to say, well, okay, let's reckon with this colonial imperial past and how best to present it and talk about it. And the reaction against it was vitriolic. That said, it would appear that most members of the National Trust thought this was very timely and should happen. But it was interesting how partisan and angry the reaction was by a very small minority, that you cannot corrupt this image we have of that period by bringing race and empire in. Now, I think that battle is being lost, that side, thank goodness, but I think we were shocked at how strong the reaction was.
Yeah, that was the interim slavery report that the National Trust produced in September 2020. And the main academic leading on that, Professor Corinne Farlow, received death threats and couldn't leave her house for so many months because she had been consulting the National Trust and multiple properties, multiple curators, historians, scholars, everyone working together to do this work. But that kind of started to have a ripple effect, particularly within a British context at this point. And I think what you've just said is absolutely true. It's this idea of, we go to these places, we have tea and we have scones, and we don't want to think about anything else. Right. Okay, well, why are we having tea? Can we actually, let's unpick that a little bit. And I think it's the fandom, it's the excitement around the Regency, it's the kind of the cultural practices of going to these historic houses and looking at pretty things and going through the gift shop and all of the rest. But it's also, you can do that, but you have to be engaging critically with the histories and the realities of those histories. And by tagging race into that and putting race before the Regency, that is a really brilliant way of trying to do that work. Thank you. And I'm going to stop and hand it to Trisha.
Thank our first panel, our first Race and Read Lab panel. We're going to take a 15-minute break. I'm going to suggest that you get water. We like to stay hydrated. I also want to point to, so you have an opportunity over the course of the day. So the map to which we're referring is the Belvedere Estate. It's under the glass case on this side. And then on the other side, my left, is the First American Edition. These are the two acquisitions that we'll be talking about. When we come back, we'll be talking about mapping the Regency. We'll hear from Bertie Mandelblatt, Joe Rezick, and our very first intern for the Race and Regency Lab, Connie, and they'll talk about the map and its context. So take a break, get some water, look at everything, then we'll come back in 15 minutes.